I'm Dr. Priyatej Kotipalli. As Arushi said, that I work at the Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation at Mahindra University in Hyderabad. Just to give a quick brief about what is it that we actually do at the Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. It's set up as an interdisciplinary center to cater to all of the schools at Mahindra University. That is Mahindra Ecole Centrale, the School of Management, the School of Law, the Indra Mahindra School of Education, and the forthcoming schools of the School of Digital Humanities and the School of Design. Primarily, we are tasked with two jobs. One is we need to develop an entrepreneurial curriculum for the students across each of these schools, right from the first year that they're on campus. That's one. And then the second aspect is we run the incubation center, which is called as Mahindra eHub. So primarily, if I really think about what is it that my job is, on one hand, I dabble a lot with the pedagogical aspects of curriculum development and how is it that we want to create an entrepreneurial culture on campus. That's number one. And on the other side, we're really looking at how is it that we can actually get these entrepreneurial aspirations of the students and of course people from outside as well, and can convert them into viable and tenable ventures. So this having been the brief of what exactly is it that I do at the center, and sitting back and looking at it from the perspective of, well, what kind of an approach do I want to take towards both of these tasks? I sat back to evaluate what exactly are the options that are available to me in terms of pedagogical approaches that I could be taking towards entrepreneurial development. It's in these conversations that I've found that there are certain unanswered questions. Among other things, I find that to a large extent, the conversation around entrepreneurial competencies among founders and teams within the Indian startup ecosystem is a conversation that's not, that's either nascent or not completely developed, or is not nuanced enough to generate some better insights onto approaches of how is it that we can develop, how we can rather make them better, per se, how entrepreneurial competencies can have consequences to venture outcomes. As you all know, of every 10 startups, only one succeeds. The question is, why is that? Of course, there are quite a few conversations around that particular question, but the way in which I actually wanted to approach that question was to focus on what is it that we do at the university, or what is it that we do in an incubation program. So basically, what is it that we do at the approach level in planning the intervention for these students or founders and their teams when they're coming to incubation centers that has a better output or an outcome in terms of the times that they're actually spending on the program. Now, having said so, last year, or rather not last year, some 4 or 5 months back, I had written a research grant, which was an internal research grant, and I was lucky enough to have been granted the award for it. And so this set off the motion for me to kind of start this entire research on studying the entrepreneurial competencies of founders and teams. And then the way in which I kind of approach this particular topic is, what is it that we are doing in terms of our interventions that enable the enhancement of these competencies? Now, I'm using this word quite a bit, but what do we mean by all of this is what I'm going to try to share with you in this particular presentation. Given the fact that this research is still quite nascent, I'm going to be unable to share with you, let's say, the outputs of it, even if initial, because much of the data has just started to come in at this moment, and I still have to sift through it. So what is it that I am going to be able to do, or what this talk is primarily going to be about, is I'm going to be sharing with you what this ongoing research is all about. And I'm going to be presenting to you the theoretical approaches to the idea of entrepreneurial competencies. And of course, between both of these, I'm going to be setting the stage by which we're actually going to be asking a lot of questions about why is this notion of entrepreneurial competencies important? What has that got to do with pedagogical approaches to entrepreneurial development? And what has this got to do with entrepreneurial or developing an entrepreneurial culture? Or what this term in terms of praxis of entrepreneurship mean at all? And last but not the least, how is it that we're actually going to be planning our interventions? Or how do we want to even have a conversation about if the approach and the approach that we're taking towards the intervention per se to develop these entrepreneurial competencies, is it effective or not? So the effort of this particular presentation today is to kind of wake up a whole lot of these questions. And of course, to do that, I'm going to be giving a little bit of a theoretical background. So primarily, when we start researching about the notion of entrepreneurial competencies, the most recent paper of Barbara Bird actually comes out in the edited volume of Seminal Ideas for the next 25 years of advances. And the paper itself is called Towards a Theory of Entrepreneurial Competencies. In that entire paper, she actually looks at the various entrepreneurial competencies that are required by startups and the founders and their teams through various stages of the venture development. So there is one at the onset of having the entrepreneurial or having the idea, and then building your startup team, and then second, growing it through its survival phase, and last but not the least, making it big in terms of growth and so forth. And she lists out that at each and every stage that a startup actually goes through, there are a different set of competencies that are actually going to be required. Some are truly entrepreneurial traits per se, and quite others actually come into the realm of managerial competencies. But the kicking in of these managerial competencies primarily happens a lot more from the perspective when you are moving beyond the startup phase and going into the survival and then the growth phase. Now, having said so, relative to where I am, that is primarily at an entrepreneurial university, my concern is to look at it from the perspective of looking at it from the initial phase. That is, how do we look at the minimum threshold of competencies that are required by founders and by extension their teams, that kind of allows them to have a higher chance of success vis-a-vis higher chance of success per se. So in this particular context or this particular conversation, what then happens is Barbara Bird kind of focuses on the work of McClelland. And in the work of McClelland, there are 10 such competencies that emerge out, which she calls as the minimum threshold of competencies that are required by founders and their teams. And if they are able to kind of work on these competencies, it has better venture outcomes, or they become good predictors to see if this venture is actually going to succeed through its entire startup phase and go to the other phases or not. So before we talk a little bit more about McClelland's theory, so primarily McClelland kind of makes his contribution towards entrepreneurial competencies, but he actually, or rather he makes his contribution to this notion, to this conversation around entrepreneurial competencies, but he actually entered it from the perspective of what motivates people. Primarily, he lists out that there are three key motivating factors for people. One is achievement motivation, the other one is affiliation motivation, and last but not the least, there is a power motivation. Now, each of these motivations that kind of go along in trying to get people to get off their asses and do something in life, what he found is that people who actually score high on the matrices for achievement motivation exhibit certain, or rather people who actually score high on achievement motivation tend to be more entrepreneurial than people who actually score high on affiliation and power. So when he figured, or when he looked at the data from that perspective, that why is it, or rather the question for him then became, why is it that the people who are scoring high on achievement motivation more successful as entrepreneurs? And he tried to figure out, maybe it has got to do with some behavioral aspects, or it has got to do with certain traits that we can understand that helps us plan, let's say, better interventions per se. So around the same time, what also happens is primarily when you're talking about McClelland's work, we're really talking about the late 1960s and early 1970s per se. Now, around that same time, the State Department in the US contracted McClelland, and McClelland set up this company called as McBurr. And the primary brief given to them is that the State Department wanted to develop some sort of a program to be implemented through USAID so that they can provide these programs to developing economies across the world in providing training such that more entrepreneurial activities can happen in those developing economies. So McClelland then does this entire research around entrepreneurial competencies, primarily researching people or people who actually scored high on achievement motivation in India, Malawi, and Ecuador. And on the basis of that entire research, and of course, the instrument that he uses there is a behavioral event interview. And this is a methodology that you can actually get from McBurr itself at this moment in time as well. And so he's able to populate an entire list of 20 competencies, of which 10 stand out between all of these areas of research that he actually performs. These 10 competencies are opportunity seeking and initiation. That is the people, the traits that these entrepreneurs who are scoring high on achievement motivation are having: risk taking, commitment to work contract, information seeking, demand for efficiency and quality, persistence, goal setting, systematic planning and monitoring, persuasion, networking, independence, and self-confidence. So there is a whole set of 10 competencies that he lists out that he finds to be significant for and that people who are actually exhibiting these 10 traits tend to be more successful as entrepreneurs, or rather these are the skills that they're having that allows them to have better venture outcomes per se. So around the time when you're really talking about McClelland finishing his work with McBurr and USAID, it so happens that the State Department has a change in heart. And so this program never gets implemented by USAID, but around the same time, UNCTAD actually picks it up and formulates this program called as Priyatej. So what that then becomes is one of the first approaches or one of the first behavioral approaches to entrepreneurial development. Now, what do I mean by that when I'm saying a behavioral approach to entrepreneurial development? So primarily when you're looking at it from the perspective of what has happened at that time and also to a large extent what happens today also is that when we look at entrepreneurial education or the pedagogical approach that we take towards entrepreneurial education or entrepreneurial development per se, we tend to treat entrepreneurship more as a process. So looking at it from the perspective of a process primarily takes a very managerial approach towards entrepreneurship as a subject per se. So what that means is that there is an input and then there is an output. So in the input, you're kind of coming up with the idea, you're doing a whole lot of market research, you're kind of coming up with your DPR, then you're going to figure out how much finances you're going to be requiring. Then you're actually going to go and try to see how you're going to get that finance and a whole lot of other things. And towards the output of that, if you do all of these activities right, then the output would be a successful venture. That's one of the ways, or that's primarily one of the key ways in which entrepreneurship or entrepreneurial development is kind of being approached per se from a pedagogical perspective. So what has also become interesting per se in the last decade or a decade and a half of entrepreneurial research is, and of course, when you're talking about this linear approach or approaching entrepreneurship as a process, you're primarily looking at it from the perspective of using a predictive logic. That is, to a large extent, you know what the end outcome looks like. And so a lot of things that you're doing is planning and executing. A good analogy for this is you have a vision, or rather, it's when you are trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle. At the onset of solving that jigsaw puzzle, you're looking at the image, and then you know where is it that you need to get towards. And so you're organizing all of the resources, time, effort, and everything in trying to piece that picture together. Now, this is what it is called a predictive logic, or using predictive logic as a pedagogical approach when teaching entrepreneurship per se. On the other side, and as I said, in the last decade and a half, one of the new logics that have come into entrepreneurial education is this notion of using creation logic. Creation logic primarily states that we don't know how the end outcome is going to look like, or rather, it accepts the fact that the future is incredibly unpredictable. But when I'm going to be looking at entrepreneurship not as a process, but as a continuous method where I'm trying new and innovative ideas till I actually find the right product and actually make that happen, that kind of ends up being a creation approach or creation pedagogy towards entrepreneurial education per se. Now, one of the, if you're talking about UNCTAD and Priyatej, to a large extent, you think about, or rather this program has been in place for the last 30 years. And of course, there's also an Priyatej office in India, and they've been running the program for the last 20 years as well, per se. It's in Kolkata. They actually pick up the work of McClellan and this entire thing of entrepreneurial competencies, and then they built up the Priyatej program around it. So this was one of the first approaches towards a behavioral approach to entrepreneurial development, where the focus was a lot more on what is it that the entrepreneurs do, as opposed to focusing a lot more on the idea of what the entrepreneurs want to build. So what the entrepreneur wants to build kind of almost became like, yeah, that you're going to figure out in any case. But what is it that we're really going to be working on is how you're actually going to be entrepreneurial about building that particular product or an idea and so forth. So it turns out that it allows founders and teams to be a lot more nimble, and they're always going to be finding new and innovative ways in which they're actually going to problem solve, as opposed to being stuck when they're approaching the entrepreneurial process or the entrepreneurial method, when you're approaching entrepreneurship as a process. So what's different between both of these methodologies is that when you're looking at it from the perspective of looking at entrepreneurship as a method, two terminologies then become very important. The praxis of entrepreneurship, and then the culture, that is the set of beliefs and or values that you kind of have, or that you're actually imbibing in this entire process, that allows you to kind of really work on these or work on these competencies per se. Now, in the previous conversation, we were looking at entrepreneurship primarily as a process. that is as an input and an output method, the chances of you actually working on the entrepreneurial competencies is going to be way less, as opposed to looking at it from the perspective of using a creation logic, that is looking at entrepreneurship as a method or a means of continually working on the, or rather continually working on each of these competencies. That is through the praxis of entrepreneurship, that is by practicing entrepreneurship and not planning all that much, but doing it and learning by doing it. That is, let's say you are to a large extent internalizing the idea that entrepreneurship is a very tacit learning. That is, you're only going to be able to do by doing it over and over, and maybe you're only going to be able to learn it by failing and learning from that failure and actually building from it. So when you're looking at it from that perspective, this entire notion of looking at, let's say, entrepreneurship as a method becomes more interesting, and looking at the Babson methodology of entrepreneurial thought and action, or even the methodology that Saraswati talks about in terms of effectuation, become interesting to see how is it that you're actually going to be building this praxis of entrepreneurship, and how that's actually going to be defining the culture. So one example of that, again, we go back and talk about what exactly happens at Priyatej. So they do this entire program together, and primarily the process kind of takes into account that first, to develop these entrepreneurial competencies, there needs to be an awareness. Second, there needs to be an understanding. Third, there needs to be application of those, of what is it that you understood in terms of those 10 traits or competencies that we talked about, and then internalization to a large extent. So when we are talking about development of these competencies, the awareness part kind of becomes the pivotal aspect of this entire conversation then. Primarily when I'm teaching entrepreneurship at Mahindra University to my students, almost right from their first year, what we do is we administer this questionnaire that kind of gives them, it's a self-administered questionnaire that actually ranks them in terms of how is it that they're scoring on each of these entrepreneurial competencies. And again, what is it that Empiric does? They also take they actually take the same methodology, rather we actually take from them, as a matter of fact. And then from there on in, we combine that with this entire notion of taking a creation logic towards entrepreneurial education or pedagogy. And then we look at it from the perspective of entrepreneurship being a method than just being a process. So we kind of really get them to take a lot of micro ventures, and then get them to get a taste of how is it that they are going to be able to apply each of these competencies per se. And so first of all, there has to be an awareness among your subjects, or among your students or the startup founders and their teams, that there indeed exists some things like entrepreneurial competencies, and of course you use a diagnostic tool for that. But of course, it's not enough that they are aware of the fact that they have entrepreneurial competencies. It kind of needs to result into them using these entrepreneurial competencies, or actively practicing on an entrepreneurial venture using each of these entrepreneurial competencies.